You mentioned somebody might want to test along the way to see if they're in ketosis. Is there a certain time of day that we want to do that test? Like first thing in the morning while we're fasted, after a meal, or does it really matter?
Yeah, I like doing it about an hour after waking up, not necessarily first thing in the morning, because we're going to have a cortisol response just by waking up with the sun. There's a cortisol response. It could alter some of the numbers, but after an hour or so after you wake up, things start to normalize with cortisol. And if you test an hour after waking up, that's a good time to test. I also like testing, as you mentioned, about an hour or two after eating, so that's postprandial to make sure you're still in ketosis. And I also like checking blood sugar levels too. And the cool thing about a machine like the keto-mojo, it gives you both blood glucose and blood ketones. Blood sugars are an important thing to check, and I'd love to get into that if you want.
Sure, let's continue.
Yeah, so we know that the human body, what's considered an optimal state, is 1 teaspoon of sugar in the entire bloodstream. That's 80 milligrams per deciliters when you're testing your blood sugars, whether it's a finger prick or like a continuous glucose monitor. 80 milligrams per deciliter, which is 1 teaspoon in the bloodstream. That's considered an optimal fasting state. If your blood sugars are higher than that in a fasted state, you're aging faster. We know that excess glucose in the bloodstream, number one, strips nitric oxide from your arteries and from your body, which creates vasoconstriction, which is the narrowing of your arteries. When that happens, your heart has to pump harder and it increases your blood pressure. That leads to high blood pressure. That's a problem. We also know when you have higher levels of blood sugar, you're going to have higher levels of insulin. Now, insulin, and I know you've interviewed so many amazing people on your show, Jesse. We know insulin is a fat storage energy sensing hormone. It's not a bad hormone unless it's elevated, unless it's called all the time. But insulin is a bully hormone. When insulin is elevated, the fat burning hormones are hiding. And here's the thing. Insulin levels could be elevated on average for 6 to 14 years before any of the blood sugars or even your A1C changes. 6 to 14 years, you can have insulin resistance. So I believe one of the most important tests that you can get for your metabolism, for health in general, is a fasting insulin blood test. It's cheap, it's easy. And what it's going to show you is if you have insulin resistance, in other words, hyperinsulinemia. We want our fasting insulin to be in the single digits. 3 to 7 is optimal to hit. If you're 12, 15, 17, you have signs of insulin resistance. If you're over 20, you have full-blown insulin resistance, but your blood sugars might look fine. What's happening is your body's trying to overcompensate by producing, your pancreas is producing so much insulin to shuttle the excess blood glucose out of the bloodstream. But that happens for 16 to 14 years, and then all of a sudden, your receptor sites for insulin get burned out, and then blood sugars increase. So I love testing blood sugars. I love testing fasting insulin. And one of the things you could also look at with your blood sugars is your postprandial blood sugar levels. This gives you a good sign whether or not you have insulin resistance. So what you want to do is test your blood sugar levels right before you have a meal. Let's say it's 85 milligrams per deciliter. You're fasted before you eat. Great blood sugar level. You eat a meal, and then an hour after eating the meal, you test the blood sugars again. You want to make sure it doesn't go over 120. 2 hours after eating, it should go back to baseline, around 85 in this scenario. That's a good sign that you produced enough insulin, you regulated the glucose, you used it for energy, and you're back to homeostasis. But if you see those blood sugars stay elevated 2 hours later, let's say it's still above 100 2 hours later, that's a problem, right? And just by looking at your blood sugar levels, you can get a good idea if you need to make changes or not.
For somebody that's somewhere along that continuum of insulin resistance all the way to type 2 diabetes, and they're catching on to what we're talking about here about going into ketosis, measuring ketones, can somebody who is still on that insulin resistance spectrum, by adopting the diet and fasting, produce ketones? Or is that something that needs to be reversed before they get to that point?
They can. Yeah, they might have more of a challenge producing it, Jesse. But I've seen individuals with even full-blown type 2 diabetes who've had it for years adopt this ketogenic approach combined with fasting, and they're able to produce ketones. Now, in general, As you lower your blood sugar levels, the more ketones you're going to be able to produce. You might have more of a challenge getting into therapeutic doses of ketones, which is over like 3.0 milliliters millimoles per liter, but you could still produce ketones. You could still get around 0.6, 0.7 over time as you become more insulin sensitive, start burning off the excess stored sugar and stored body fat. Those ketones will begin to rise. So it might take a little longer for that person to achieve the therapeutic doses of ketones, but you could definitely produce it.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch a full episode. I'll see you over there.
I did the experiment. So I did 90 days of carnivore, and a couple of interesting things happened. I dropped 6% body fat, meaning a total of 6% body fat reduction during the 90 days. And I didn't even realize that I needed to lose those 6% body fat.